Preston Whitaker sat on his leather couch, staring at a wedding invitation that might as well have been a slap in the face. The words glared back at him in fancy script. "You are invited to the wedding of Daphne Lockwood and Julian Hartford." Daphne wasn't just any ex. She was the ex, the one he'd planned to marry before she decided he was too busy for love and ran off with someone else. Preston's ego was far too big to let this go without making a statement. He needed a plan to show up at that wedding and prove he was doing just fine. No, better than fine, he wanted Daphne to know exactly what she gave up. That's when his eyes landed on Serena Halstead, his maid. She was quietly folding laundry by the window, completely unaware of his gaze. Serena wasn't glamorous like the women Preston usually surrounded himself with, but there was something about her. Her natural beauty, her unpolished charm, that was refreshing. "Serena," his commanding voice cut through the silence. She turned, brows raised. "Yes, Mr. Whitaker? I need you to come with me to an event." Her face scrunched up in confusion. "An event? Me?" Preston sighed, as if the idea was obvious. "Yes, you." The idea was ludicrous, but in his head it made perfect sense. He needed someone unexpected to make an impression, and Serena fit the bill perfectly. Simple, genuine, and completely unlike the polished crowd that would be at the wedding. "It's personal," he added, as though that explained anything. "You'll just pretend to be my date, that's it." "Why me?" she asked, folding her arms. He hesitated, locking eyes with her. "Because you're different." The answer wasn't exactly a compliment, but Serena let it slide. Her bills were piling up, and this bizarre offer felt like a golden ticket to some extra cash. "Fine, I'll do it," she agreed reluctantly. "But I'm wearing something comfortable." Preston chuckled dryly, his tone almost mocking. "This isn't about comfort, Serena. It's about making an impression." Her blood boiled, but she bit her tongue. It was one night. Her mom always said, "Sometimes you gotta swallow your pride to get ahead." Over the next few days, Preston turned Serena into his personal project. Stylists, makeup artists, tailors, he left no detail untouched. Serena, meanwhile, gritted her teeth and played along, counting the hours until she could walk away with her paycheck and never hear his name again. The night of the wedding arrived. When Serena looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The sleek black dress clung to her figure in all the right ways. From behind her, Preston watched silently. For a moment, something in his expression softened. "You look adequate," he said, trying to sound indifferent, though a faint smile betrayed him. "Adequate? Wow, don't overdo the compliments," Serena shot back, her tone dripping with sarcasm. And just like that, they were off, each with their own agenda. Preston wanted to make a statement. Serena just wanted to get through the night. Neither of them had any idea how much that night was about to change their lives. The drive to the wedding was heavy with silence. Serena sat stiffly in the car, trying to adjust to the glamorous dress that felt more like a costume than clothing. Preston, on the other hand, stared out the window, his usual air of confidence firmly in place. "Relax," he said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "You'll do fine." Serena let out a dry laugh. "Oh, thanks. I'll try to survive the night surrounded by people who probably think I'm the hired help." Preston smirked. "You're not giving yourself enough credit. Just keep your head up and let me handle the rest." As they pulled up to the venue, Serena's heart sank. The mansion hosting the wedding looked like something out of a movie. Giant chandeliers visible through the tall windows, a valet line filled with luxury cars, and guests dressed in designer outfits that probably cost more than her rent for a year. "Showtime," Preston muttered as he stepped out of the car. He walked around to open her door, offering his hand. Serena hesitated but took it, her nerves mounting with every step toward the entrance. Inside, the room buzzed with laughter and chatter. The moment they walked in, the attention shifted to them like a spotlight. Heads turned, whispers began, and Serena could feel the weight of 100 stares. She instinctively clutched Preston's arm tighter. "Don't let them intimidate you," he whispered, leaning close to her ear. "You're here because you belong." The words were oddly reassuring, though she wasn't sure if she believed them. They were quickly approached by Wallace Hargrove, an older man with a broad smile and a firm handshake. "Preston!" Wallace exclaimed, his tone warm but curious. "I didn't think you'd actually show, and with such a charming companion, no less." Preston returned the handshake effortlessly, flashing his practiced smile. "Of course, Wallace. After all, Daphne and I have history. I couldn't miss this." Serena's stomach twisted. The way Preston said it sounded calculated, as if every word was meant to remind Daphne of what she'd left behind. Wallace's gaze flicked to Serena, his eyes crinkling in polite curiosity. "And you are?" "Serena," she said, keeping her tone even. "It's nice to meet you." Wallace nodded, clearly impressed by her poise. "Lovely to meet you, Serena." As Wallace moved on, Preston led Serena further into the crowd. She couldn't help but notice the murmurs behind her back, the way some women glanced at her dress and smirked, their whispers barely concealed. It was exhausting, and they hadn't even made it to the main event. "Don't engage," Preston said under his breath, sensing her frustration. "They're irrelevant." Serena bit her tongue, but her patience was wearing thin. The evening dragged on, a blur of fake smiles and small talk. Then, the moment Serena had been dreading arrived: Daphne Lockwood. Daphne was radiant in her wedding gown, her laughter cutting through the room like a knife. When her eyes landed on Preston and Serena, her smile faltered for just a second before she composed herself and walked over. "Well, Preston," Daphne began, her voice dripping with sweetness, "I wasn't sure you'd come. And who's this lovely guest?" "This is Serena Halstead," Preston said smoothly. "She's important to me." Serena almost choked on the words. Important? That wasn't part of the deal. But Daphne's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and Serena could feel the woman sizing her up. "How unexpected," Daphne said with a thin smile. "Well, good luck, dear. You'll need it." Serena forced herself to smile back, even though her blood was boiling. As Daphne walked away, her heart pounded in her chest. She glanced at Preston, who seemed unfazed. "What did she mean by that?" Serena asked quietly. Preston shrugged. "Daphne thrives on games. Don't let it get to you." But it did get to her. The whispers, the judgmental stares, Daphne's veiled insults. It was all too much. Serena had told herself she'd survive the night and leave with her dignity intact, but as the night wore on, she wasn't sure how much more she could take. Serena tried to focus on her breathing as she stood by Preston's side. The room felt smaller with every glance, every whisper that seemed to linger in the air around her. The urge to run was strong, but she reminded herself why she'd agreed to this: the money, the opportunity to finally catch up on her bills, and maybe, just maybe, prove something to herself. "Time to dance," Preston said suddenly, snapping her out of her thoughts. "What, dance?" Serena's voice pitched slightly in panic. "I didn't sign up for this." Preston smirked, offering his hand. "Trust me, you'll be fine." Before she could argue, he was already leading her to the dance floor. The lights seemed brighter there, every eye in the room watching as Preston placed his hand on her waist. Serena stiffened, glancing nervously around. "Look at me, not them," Preston said softly, his tone surprisingly gentle. "You're doing fine." Reluctantly, she let herself follow his lead. To her surprise, he was an excellent dancer, guiding her across the floor with a confidence that was almost contagious. For a moment, she forgot about the stares and the whispers, focusing instead on the rhythm of the music and the steadiness of his hand. "You're a quick learner," Preston said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yeah, well, I don't have much of a choice, do I?" she shot back, her sarcasm masking her nerves. He chuckled. "You're tougher than you look." As the dance ended, a smattering of applause broke out. Preston led Serena back to their table, but she could feel the weight of the room's judgment. Daphne's gaze followed them like a hawk, and Serena knew this wasn't over. Sure enough, moments later, Daphne approached their table, her smile as sharp as the diamonds on her necklace. "Enjoying the night, Preston?" she asked sweetly, though her eyes were locked on Serena. "Of course," Preston replied coolly. "It's a lovely wedding." Daphne turned her attention to Serena. "And you? This must be overwhelming." Serena smiled tightly. "Not at all. I'm having a great time." Daphne laughed softly as though Serena had said something amusing. "Well, I hope you're ready for the attention. People around here can be curious." Serena bit back a retort, refusing to give Daphne the satisfaction. As the bride walked away, Preston leaned closer, his expression unreadable. "What did she say?" he asked. "Nothing I couldn't handle," Serena replied, though her jaw was tight. Preston nodded, but his eyes stayed on Daphne. For the first time that night, Serena saw a crack in his armor. He wasn't as unaffected as he wanted everyone to believe. This wasn't just about making a statement. This was personal. The rest of the evening was a blur of forced smiles and stiff interactions. Serena did her best to keep up appearances, but the tension was exhausting. By the time the night was winding down, she was ready to leave and never look back. In the car ride home, the silence was deafening. Serena stared out the window, her mind racing. Preston seemed lost in thought, his jaw clenched as he gripped the steering wheel. "You know," Serena said finally, breaking the quiet, "you could have just not come. No one forced you to be there." Preston glanced at her, his expression guarded. "And let her think she won? Not a chance." Serena shook her head. "You think this was about winning, because it looked more like you were losing." Preston didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the road. For the first time, Serena wondered if there was more to him than the arrogant, controlled persona he projected. But whatever it wasn't her problem. By the time they reached his estate, Serena was ready to bolt. She stepped out of the car, turning to face him. "Well, that was fun," she said dryly. "Let me know where to send my bill." Preston smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Don't worry, you'll get what you're owed." And as she walked toward her room, Serena couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The next morning, Serena woke up with a pounding headache, not from alcohol, but from the emotional exhaustion of the night before. She replayed every conversation, every judgmental glance, and especially Daphne's condescending smirk. She had done what she set out to do, survive. But as she stood in her small, modest room, the memory of Preston's cold smirk stuck with her. Was it worth it? Downstairs, Preston was already in full business mode, sitting at the head of the massive dining table with a cup of coffee and his tablet. His mood was unreadable as usual, but Serena noticed a certain tension in his shoulders. He barely glanced up as she entered the room. "Morning," Serena said, her tone neutral. Preston didn't look up. "Morning. Coffee's on the counter." She poured herself a cup, trying to ignore the awkwardness between them. It was like the energy from the night before had followed them into the house. As she sipped, she finally broke the silence. "So, was it worth it?" she asked, leaning against the counter. Preston's fingers paused on his tablet screen. "What do you mean?" "Last night, the wedding, dragging me into that mess. Did it accomplish whatever you wanted?" He set the tablet down and looked at her, his expression hard. "I wasn't dragging you into anything. You agreed." Serena raised an eyebrow. "You practically ordered me. But okay, let's say I agreed. Did it work? Did Daphne care that you showed up with someone like me?" Preston's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he didn't answer. Then with a shrug, he muttered, "It wasn't about her." "Sure it wasn't," Serena said, rolling her eyes. "You should have seen your face every time she looked at us. You were playing a game and you're terrible at hiding it." Preston stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think I do," Serena shot back, her voice rising. "You're so obsessed with proving something to her that you can't even see how ridiculous you look." The room went quiet, the tension crackling like static. Preston stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Serena thought he might lash out, but instead, he just shook his head and walked out of the room. Later that day, Serena decided to focus on her own life. She spent hours applying for new jobs, determined to leave Preston's world behind as soon as possible. She didn't belong in his universe of luxury and ego. She had dreams of her own, and they didn't include being dragged into his petty revenge plots. Meanwhile, Preston found himself unable to concentrate. Sitting in his office, he scrolled through emails, but his mind kept drifting back to Serena. Her words had stung, not because they were rude, but because they were true. He had been playing a game, and it wasn't working. That evening, while Serena was in her room, there was a knock on her door. She opened it to find Preston standing there, looking almost apologetic. "What?" she asked, crossing her arms. "I need to talk to you," he said, his tone unusually soft. "Can I come in?" She hesitated, but stepped aside. He entered the small space, glancing around before finally meeting her eyes. "You were right," he admitted. "About last night. I was trying to prove something to Daphne, and it didn't work." Serena blinked, surprised by his honesty. "Okay, and why are you telling me this?" "Because I owe you an apology. I dragged you into something that wasn't your problem, and I didn't treat you fairly. You didn't deserve that." She studied him for a moment, trying to decide if he was being sincere. Finally, she sighed. "Fine. Apology accepted. But let me be clear, I'm done with this nonsense. No more weddings, no more revenge plans. I've got enough on my plate." Preston nodded. "Fair enough." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "You're different, Serena, and that's not a bad thing." She rolled her eyes. "Good night, Preston." As the door closed behind him, Serena felt a strange mix of emotions. Maybe, just maybe, Preston Whitaker was more human than she'd given him credit for. The days that followed were surprisingly calm, at least on the surface. Serena kept to herself, busying her time with applications and sketching out ideas for a design course she dreamed of taking. Preston, however, wasn't as invisible as she'd hoped. Every time she passed through the hallways or walked into the kitchen, he was there, watching, thinking. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was planning something again. Her suspicions were confirmed one evening when she found Preston waiting in the living room, seated in his usual commanding way. He looked up as she entered, his face unreadable. "Serena," he started, his tone formal, "I've been thinking." "That sounds dangerous," she quipped, folding her arms. Preston smirked faintly but didn't rise to the bait. "I want to help you." She blinked, caught off guard. "Help me? With what?" "With your future," he said simply. "Your work, your ideas. I've seen your sketches, your notebooks. You have talent, and you deserve a chance to show it." Serena frowned. "You went through my stuff. It was lying around," he said defensively. "Look, the point is I want to support you. Let me sponsor your course." Her stomach twisted at the offer. On one hand, it was tempting, an opportunity to finally pursue her dreams without worrying about money. But on the other hand, this was Preston, a man who never did anything without strings attached. "I don't need charity," she said firmly. "It's not charity," Preston countered. "It's an investment in you." Serena shook her head. "I appreciate the gesture, but I'm not interested." Preston sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Why are you so stubborn? Why are you so persistent?" She shot back. "You think throwing money at me will fix everything? Newsflash, not everyone is for sale, Preston." Her words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. For the first time, Preston looked genuinely frustrated, his composure cracking ever so slightly. "This isn't about buying you," he said, his voice low. "It's about making amends for everything." Serena stared at him, her resolve softening just a fraction. "If you really want to make amends, stop trying to control everything. Let me figure it out on my own." Preston nodded slowly, though his expression was tinged with regret. "Fair enough." That same evening, Serena decided to take a walk to clear her head. The cool night air was refreshing, a stark contrast to the stifling tension of the house. As she strolled through the quiet streets, her mind wandered to Preston's words. He had a way of getting under her skin, making her question things she'd always been sure of. Meanwhile, back at the estate, Preston sat alone in his study, nursing a glass of whiskey. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control, not just over Serena, but over himself. She was different, yes, but in ways that unsettled him. She challenged him, made him see things he'd spent years ignoring. And that terrified him. The next morning, Serena woke up to an email that nearly made her spit out her coffee. It was an invitation to an exclusive networking event for designers and entrepreneurs. At first, she thought it was a scam, but then she noticed the sender, Lila Pennington, Preston's assistant. "What the hell?" she muttered, marching straight to Preston's office. She found him at his desk, scrolling through his tablet. He looked up as she barged in, her expression livid. "What did you do?" she demanded, holding up her phone. Preston glanced at the screen and shrugged. "I pulled a few strings. Consider it a push in the right direction." "I told you I didn't need your help," she snapped. "How many times do I have to say it?" "You don't have to accept it," Preston said evenly, "but the opportunity is there if you want it." Serena clenched her fists, torn between anger and something she couldn't quite name. The event was exactly the kind of chance she needed, but the idea of accepting anything from Preston made her skin crawl. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice tight. "Take your time," Preston replied, his tone infuriatingly calm. As she walked out of his office, her mind was a whirlwind. This was more than an opportunity. It was a crossroads, and she wasn't sure which path to take. Serena spent the next few days going back and forth in her mind about the invitation. The event could open doors she'd never dreamed of, but accepting meant playing into Preston's hands, a prospect that didn't sit well with her. He was manipulative, arrogant, and far too comfortable controlling every situation. Yet, despite her reservations, she couldn't deny that he'd seen something in her work, something she had always doubted herself. When the day of the event arrived, Serena found herself standing in front of the mirror, adjusting a modest but stylish outfit. Her nerves were buzzing, but determination fueled her movements. She wasn't doing this for Preston, she was doing it for herself. She had decided to accept the invitation on her terms, not his. At the event, the atmosphere was both exciting and intimidating. The room was filled with industry giants, entrepreneurs, and innovators, each exuding confidence and charm. Serena felt out of place at first, but as she mingled, she found herself settling into the rhythm of conversations. People were curious about her designs, impressed by her vision. For the first time, she felt like she belonged. Toward the middle of the evening, she spotted Preston across the room. He was talking to a group of investors, his usual polished self, but there was a subtle difference in his demeanor. When their eyes met, he gave her a small nod, a gesture that felt almost supportive. As the night progressed, Serena's confidence grew. She presented her ideas to several key figures, receiving positive feedback and even a few offers to collaborate. It was everything she'd hoped for and more. Yet there was a nagging thought in the back of her mind. How much of this success was hers, and how much was Preston's influence? Later that evening, as the event wound down, Serena stepped out onto the balcony to catch her breath. The cool night air was a welcome relief after hours of networking. She leaned against the railing, letting the quiet wash over her. "You handled yourself well tonight." She turned to see Preston standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. He wasn't wearing his usual smug expression, and for once, his tone was free of condescension. "Thanks," she said cautiously. "But I didn't need your approval." Preston chuckled softly. "I know. That's what makes it so impressive." Serena raised an eyebrow. "What do you want, Preston?" He hesitated, as if weighing his words. "I wanted to say you were right. About everything. I've spent so much time trying to control things, trying to prove something to people who don't matter. But tonight, watching you, I realized it doesn't have to be that way." Serena blinked, caught off guard by his sincerity. "Are you saying you're finally learning how to let go?" "Something like that," he admitted. "And I owe that to you." She didn't know how to respond. Part of her wanted to believe him, but another part was still wary. Preston Whitaker wasn't the type to change overnight. "Well," she said after a moment, "good for you, but don't think this means I'm going to forget all the crap you've pulled." He smiled faintly. "I wouldn't expect you to." The next day, Serena received an email from one of the investors she'd met at the event. They were interested in partnering with her on a project, a proposal that could catapult her career to the next level. She couldn't believe it. This was the kind of break she'd been dreaming of for years. When she told Preston about the offer, his reaction surprised her. Instead of taking credit or pushing her to accept, he simply said, "You deserve it. Whatever you decide, make sure it's what you want." For the first time, Serena felt like he wasn't trying to manipulate her. Maybe, just maybe, Preston was serious about changing. But as she prepared to step into the next chapter of her life, she couldn't shake the feeling that there were still more layers to uncover. Serena's life began to shift rapidly after the event. The collaboration proposal she'd received turned into a whirlwind of meetings, emails, and design pitches. For the first time, she felt like her hard work and talent were being recognized on their own merit. Yet despite her success, one question lingered. Was Preston truly changing, or was this just another one of his manipulative games? One afternoon, Serena was reviewing sketches in her small studio when her phone buzzed. It was an unfamiliar number, but curiosity got the best of her. "Hello? Miss Halstead, this is Cassandra Everly from Urban Deco Designs. We've been following your recent work and would love to discuss a potential partnership." Serena's heart skipped a beat. Urban Deco Designs was a major name in sustainable design, a firm she'd admired for years. They wanted her. She quickly agreed to a meeting, but as the call ended, something felt off. Cassandra had mentioned that her company's interest stemmed from Preston Whitaker's recommendation. There it is, Serena thought bitterly. No matter how far she went, Preston's influence always seemed to follow. That evening, Serena confronted Preston in his study. He was sitting at his massive oak desk, sipping whiskey and scrolling through his tablet. When she stormed in, he looked up, surprised by her expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting the glass down. "Did you tell Urban Deco about me?" she demanded. Preston leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. "I might have mentioned your name. Why?" "Why?" she repeated, her voice rising. "Because I specifically told you I wanted to do this on my own. I don't need you pulling strings for me." Preston sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Serena, I wasn't trying to take away your independence. I believe in your talent, and I wanted to make sure the right people noticed it." "That's not your decision to make," she snapped. "You don't get to play puppet master with my life." His jaw tightened, and for a moment Serena thought he might argue. Instead, he nodded slowly. "You're right. I shouldn't have interfered. I wanted to help." She crossed her arms, glaring at him. "If you really want to help, then stay out of my way." Preston looked genuinely regretful, but Serena wasn't ready to let her guard down. She turned and left the room, slamming the door behind her. The following days were tense. Serena threw herself into her work, trying to block out her lingering frustration with Preston. Meanwhile, he seemed to respect her request, keeping his distance and focusing on his own projects. But Serena's suspicion wasn't entirely wrong. As she reviewed financial documents for her collaboration, something caught her eye. Several of the companies involved had long-standing ties to Preston and his father. The discovery made her blood boil. Had he been pulling the strings the whole time? She decided to confront him again. This time she wasn't going to let him sidestep her questions. "Why are you so invested in this project?" Serena asked, barging into his office. "And don't give me some vague answer about believing in my talent." Preston looked up from his desk, startled by her tone. He hesitated for a moment before replying, "It's not just about the project." "Then what is it about?" she pressed, crossing her arms. He stood, walking to the window and staring out at the city skyline. "It's about doing something that matters, for once in my life." Serena frowned, caught off guard by the vulnerability in his voice. "What are you talking about?" Preston turned to face her, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "My whole life, I've been chasing things that don't matter: money, power, approval. Watching you, seeing how passionate you are about your work, it made me realize I've been wasting my time. I want to change, Serena, and you're the reason I'm even trying." Her heart raced at his words, but she forced herself to remain calm. "That's a nice speech, Preston, but words don't mean much without actions." "I know," he said quietly. "That's why I'm asking for a chance to prove it." Serena didn't respond immediately. Part of her wanted to believe him, but another part couldn't shake the fear that this was just another game. "We'll see," she said finally, before walking out of the room. As the door closed behind her, Preston leaned against the window, staring out into the night. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely uncertain. Serena spent the next few days avoiding Preston. She buried herself in work, focusing on the project proposal and prepping for her meeting with Urban Deco Designs. Every so often, her thoughts wandered back to his confession, his vulnerability, his admission of change, but she pushed them aside. She couldn't afford to get distracted. Meanwhile, Preston was unusually quiet. He stayed in his office most of the time, taking meetings and making calls, but he didn't bother Serena. For a man who was used to being in control, giving her space was clearly not easy. The morning of her Urban Deco presentation, Serena arrived at the firm's sleek, modern offices with a mix of nerves and excitement. The meeting went better than she could have imagined. Cassandra Everly was impressed not just by Serena's designs, but by her vision and passion. By the time the meeting ended, Serena had secured a partnership on her terms. No Preston, no strings attached. As she walked out of the building, her phone buzzed with a message from Preston. How did it go? She stared at the text for a moment, debating whether to reply. Finally, she typed back, "It went well. I got it. Thanks for asking." The response came almost instantly. "Congratulations. You deserve it." She smiled despite herself. Maybe Preston really was trying to change. Later that evening, Preston knocked on her door. She opened it cautiously, half expecting another confrontation, but he simply held up a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "Peace offering?" he asked. Serena raised an eyebrow. "I didn't realize we were at war." He smirked. "We're not, but I figured you might want to celebrate your win." She hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. They sat in her small living room, sipping wine and talking about everything except work. It was the first time she'd seen Preston completely relaxed, his usual arrogance replaced by something softer. "You know," he said after a while, "I'm really proud of you." Serena laughed. "Proud? You make it sound like you had anything to do with it." "I didn't," he admitted, "but watching you succeed, it's inspiring." She rolled her eyes but couldn't hide the faint smile on her lips. "Don't get all sentimental on me, Whitaker." Preston chuckled. "Fair enough." Indeed, as the weeks went by, their interactions became less formal, more genuine. Preston started involving himself in social projects, funding sustainable initiatives and supporting small businesses. He even made a public statement committing Carter Enterprises to environmentally responsible practices, a move that shocked his investors but earned him newfound respect. Serena couldn't help but notice the changes. He wasn't just saying the right things, he was doing them. And for the first time, she found herself questioning her assumptions about him. One evening, after a long day of meetings and planning, Serena returned home to find Preston waiting for her. He looked uncharacteristically nervous, his hands in his pockets. "What's up?" she asked, setting her bag down. "I need to show you something," he said. Serena frowned. "If this is another surprise, just trust me," he interrupted, his tone serious. Against her better judgment, she followed him. He led her to the terrace of one of his buildings, where she found a lush, beautifully designed garden. Native plants, seating areas, and soft lighting created an atmosphere that felt almost magical. "This is incredible," she said, her voice filled with awe. "I wanted to create a space that represented everything you stand for," Preston said. "It's not just a garden. It's a reminder that change is possible." Serena turned to face him, her emotions swirling. "Why are you doing all this?" "Because I've spent my whole life taking from people," he said quietly. "I don't want to be that person anymore. You showed me there's another way, Serena." She didn't know how to respond. For once, Preston seemed completely sincere, his usual bravado stripped away, and for the first time, she wondered if she could really trust him. Serena stood in the garden Preston had created, the soft glow of the lights reflecting in her eyes. For a moment, she was speechless, overwhelmed by the beauty of the space and the thoughtfulness behind it. She wanted to believe in his sincerity, but years of distrust and independence made it hard to let her guard down. "This is amazing, Preston," she said finally, her voice soft, "but I'm not sure what you expect from me." "I don't expect anything," he replied, his tone uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I just wanted to show you that I'm serious about changing, and about us." Serena's heart skipped a beat. "Us," she repeated, taking a cautious step back. "Preston, this—" "I know," he interrupted, holding up his hands. "I know I've been controlling, selfish, arrogant, but you've made me see things differently. You've made me want to be better, not just for you, but for myself." She studied his face, searching for any sign of manipulation or pretense. For once, there was none. He looked at her not as a man trying to win, but as someone genuinely seeking redemption. "Preston, I don't know if I can trust you," she admitted, her voice trembling. "You've always had a way of bending things to your will, and I can't. I won't let myself be part of that." He stepped closer, his eyes earnest. "I don't want to control you, Serena. I want to support you, whatever that looks like. If you tell me to back off, I will. But if there's even the smallest part of you that believes in me, I promise I'll prove myself to you." She looked away, her emotions swirling. Part of her wanted to push him away, to protect herself from potential heartbreak, but another part, one that had grown over weeks of seeing him genuinely try, wanted to take the leap. In the days that followed, Preston continued to surprise her. He showed up at community events, funding local entrepreneurs and giving speeches about the importance of sustainable practices. He highlighted Serena's work at every opportunity, not in a way that felt like a power move, but as someone who genuinely admired her talent. Meanwhile, Serena focused on her collaboration with Urban Deco Designs. The partnership flourished, with her designs gaining recognition in the industry. She was invited to speak at conferences, her confidence growing with every milestone. But despite her professional success, Preston remained on her mind. He had become a constant presence, not just in her life, but in her thoughts. She couldn't deny that his actions were aligning with his words. He was changing, and it scared her. One evening, after an especially long day, Serena found herself standing in front of Preston's office door. She hesitated before knocking, her heart pounding in her chest. When he opened the door, his surprise was evident. "Serena," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "This is unexpected." "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice firm. "About us." Preston nodded, gesturing for her to sit. She remained standing, her nerves too restless to allow her to relax. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," she began. "About how far I've come, about the person I want to be, and about you." Preston's expression softened. And I don't know if I can trust you completely yet," she admitted, "but I think I want to try." The relief on his face was undeniable. "That's all I could ask for." "But I have conditions," she continued, holding up a hand. "You can't just buy your way through life anymore. If you want to be part of my world, you have to prove that this change isn't temporary." He nodded, his voice steady. "I will. I promise." As the days turned into weeks, Serena and Preston found themselves navigating uncharted territory. Their relationship was tentative, built on cautious trust and mutual growth. Serena continued to thrive in her career, while Preston dedicated himself to building a legacy that wasn't just about wealth, but about meaning. For the first time, Serena felt like they were partners, not just in their personal lives, but in their shared vision for the future. The day of the big launch arrived, a moment Serena had been working toward for months. The event was grander than she ever imagined, with industry leaders, journalists, and influencers in attendance. Her designs were the centerpiece, showcased as part of a sustainable corporate building initiative, and the response was overwhelming. As she stood on stage delivering her speech, Serena glanced toward the front row where Preston sat. His eyes were filled with pride, not the smug satisfaction she'd grown used to, but genuine admiration. For the first time, she felt a sense of partnership rather than obligation. "This project isn't just about sustainability," Serena concluded. "It's about proving that meaningful change is possible when people come together with shared values and a clear purpose." The crowd erupted into applause as she stepped off the stage, her heart racing with a mix of pride and relief. Preston was waiting for her near the edge of the room, his usual suit slightly rumpled, a sign of how invested he'd been in the project. "You were incredible," he said as she approached. "Thanks," Serena replied, her voice soft. "I couldn't have done it without you." He shook his head. "You did this. I was just lucky enough to be part of the journey." Serena smiled, the weight of her previous doubts lifting slightly. "Maybe you're not so bad after all, Whitaker." The launch event marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Serena, but for Preston as well. Over the next few months, their relationship deepened, built on mutual respect and a shared vision. Preston continued to champion sustainable practices and support local entrepreneurs, while Serena's designs gained international recognition. One evening, as they stood together on the terrace of the building that had once symbolized so much tension between them, Preston reached for Serena's hand. "You've changed my life in more ways than I can count," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "And I don't just want to build projects with you. I want to build a life." Serena's heart raced as he pulled a small box from his pocket and knelt down. "Serena Halstead, will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes, but her answer was immediate. "Yes, Preston. Yes." Their wedding was a quiet affair, surrounded by close friends and family. It wasn't about grandeur or showing off, it was about meaning. Together, they created a life that balanced ambition with purpose, proving that even the most unlikely pair could find common ground. And that's the story of how Serena and Preston's journey transformed not only their lives, but also the world around them. It's a reminder that even when two people come from completely different worlds, mutual respect, growth, and understanding can create something extraordinary. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to True Impressive Stories for more tales of love, redemption, and unexpected twists. There's a whole community waiting for you in the comments, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Check out the pinned comment for more stories that inspire, surprise, and move you. See you in the next one.